In the early 18th century, the Kingdom of France was on the verge of collapse due to overwhelming debt. A bold idea, now commonplace but shocking at the time, emerged, replacing gold and silver with unlimited printed banknotes to save the Treasury. This was not only the first financial experiment in human history to use printed money to rescue a nation, but also a dangerous gamble by a financial genius who pit his futuristic theories against human greed. Today we're going to talk about how a country fell into the abyss step by step. The story of the Mississippi bubble begins with this once glorious but crumbling empire. In the early 18th century, the Kingdom of France, once the hegemon of Europe, was waking from a long and illusory dream. The Sun King, Louis XIV, spent his 72-year reign solidifying the people's blood and sweat into the world-renowned Palace of Versailles, while also waging war after war, completely emptying the national treasury. But what he left behind for his successors was only a mountain of debt and a future without hope. The suffering people poured their resentment onto Louis XIV. The once sacred monarch became a tyrant and a megalomaniac. His statues were toppled, his portraits torn, and the glory of France vanished with him. The country was on the brink of bankruptcy. Just how rotten was France's financial system? The national debt was as high as 3 billion livres, while the total annual tax revenue was only 145 million, after deducting 142 million for daily government expenses. Only a meager surplus of 3 million livres remained each year. This pitiful balance couldn't even come close to paying the interest on the 3 billion livre debt. The credit system had completely collapsed, and the entire country was shrouded in a gloom of despair. Louis XV was only 7 years old, and the regent, Philippe II, Duke of Orleans, guided the destiny of France, but he knew nothing about economics. To clean up this mess, he established a special committee to deal with the debt problem. Committee member the Duke of St. Simon believed that only by declaring government bankruptcy could the country be saved, that is, refusing to repay all or part of the debt to solve the predicament. But this proposal was resolutely opposed by all other committee members, because the biggest victims of national bankruptcy would be the noble class represented by these members. Declaring bankruptcy was unacceptable no matter what. First, many nobles and wealthy merchants were themselves the largest creditors of the national debt, and their fortunes would vanish instantly. Second, the credibility of the royal family would be destroyed, and it would no longer be possible to maintain the operation of the massive state machine through borrowing. More critically, this would fundamentally shake the legitimacy of the divine right of kings, trigger massive riots, and cause the foundation of aristocratic privileges to collapse completely. History taught them that famine and financial collapse were often the fuses for revolution. Faced with this mess, a series of foolish moves by the committee only made things worse. They first announced a recoinage, which meant reducing the precious metal content in coins, allowing the government to earn the difference by exchanging coins. But the rich quickly saw through the government's trick. Expecting the currency to devalue, they melted coins into gold bars or smuggled them abroad. As a result, the government only harvested 72 million livres for a 3 billion hole. This was a drop in the bucket. Moreover, commercial activities across the country fell into chaos, and the people complained loudly. Seeing the situation turn bad, the government hurriedly announced tax cuts to appease the people. However, this short-term political soothing could not make up for the wealth loss suffered by the public due to currency devaluation and their complete loss of confidence in the government's credit. The first move didn't solve the problem, so the government came up with a second foolish move, a high-profile anti-corruption campaign. By offering a share of confiscated property as a reward to encourage public reporting, the common people clapped their hands in approval. But the result was a mess. Many officials had long hidden their assets tightly, and the money seized by the government was pitifully small. Even more ridiculous, as long as one bribed the officials, the charges could be written off. The entire bureaucratic system was rotten to the core. This anti-corruption movement ultimately lined the pockets of officials but emptied the national treasury. A large part of the 180 million livres collected was stuffed into the pockets of officials and nobles themselves. And in the later stages of the anti-corruption campaign, when money was still insufficient, the spearhead began to turn against legitimate merchants and minor officials whose crimes did not warrant such treatment. In the end, everyone was in danger, complaints were everywhere, and this policy had to be abandoned. The government finally canceled the measure and even pardoned a group of people. Just as the committee was at its wits' end, a maverick foreigner entered the regent's field of vision. He was John Law, who would go down in history either as a legend or a villain, a Scottish gambler and mathematical genius. John Law had neither a prominent noble background nor a strong financial backing, but he proposed a plan so bold it bordered on madness. Claiming to be able to turn things around overnight and pull France back from the abyss, the Regent, already anxious about the country's chronic illness and possessing a typical ostrich personality, was instantly captivated by John Law's plan. He admired Law's talent and yearned even more for the perfect solution. Law described one that could escape the predicament without enduring pain. In that era, the only measure of wealth was gold and silver. People generally believed that a country's wealth was equal to the quantity of precious metals stored in its treasury. Any attempt to replace gold and silver with paper would be seen as fraud and madness, just like the painful lesson of Louis XIV in the past. Because there wasn't enough gold and silver in the treasury to pay expenses, Louis XIV had issued a temporary emergency note, promising to repay in livre coins at a future date. However, the bankrupt credibility of the royal family caused these notes to devalue like garbage in the market, and the public completely lost trust in such paper symbols. But John Law completely overturned the conservative concepts of the time, proposing a theory that seems commonplace today but was subversive back then. He argued that a country's wealth potential comes from the land, labor, and productivity in circulation, not precious metals buried underground. He issued a revolutionary declaration. What limited France was not a lack of gold, but a drying up of credit. He advocated that the state should establish a specialized issuing agency to issue paper money that could expand and contract according to economic needs, using national credit and its inherent productivity as collateral. This paper money was the true flowing blood, capable of activating commercial activities that had stagnated due to a lack of coins. Law's paper money was completely different from Louis XIV's IOUs. It was designed to permanently replace metallic currency. He knew deeply that the magic of paper money lay in confidence. So the notes issued by his bank had to promise that they could be exchanged for coins at face value at any time. This was a sharp contrast to the low credit, discounted exchange of Louis XIV's IOUs. His theory bore striking similarities to modern central banking systems and quantitative easing policies in many ways. For the French government, which was severely lacking in liquidity, this theory was simply a life-saving straw in a desperate situation. It offered a shortcut around painful fiscal austerity, dealing with astronomical debt and interest burdens by issuing paper money. The Regent, a ruler bound by traditional thinking, was completely won over by John Law's seemingly perfect, cross-generational financial theory. In his eyes, John Law was a financier pushing the times forward. Thus, France began the first monetary experiment in history based on a complete economic theory. John Law persuaded the French government with his paper money magic. Now, he needed a massive vehicle to integrate national assets, absorb old debt, and fully push his experiment of replacing coins with paper money. John Law understood deeply that to let paper money replace gold, a reliable credit mechanism must first be rebuilt. He needed a solid starting point to realize his paper money theory. And that starting point was the Banque Générale General Bank. In 1716, the General Bank was officially established. This was no ordinary private bank. It held a special status chartered by the king. Soon, John Law's bank immediately issued banknotes, which was the core practice of his theory. These notes were designed to be stable and reliable currency, promising to be exchangeable for livre coins at face value at any time. This full convertibility was the key. He cleverly avoided the historical shadow of paper money devaluation from Louis XIV's time, winning the necessary trust for the new currency. The issuance based on bank notes produced immediate effects in the business world. In Paris, where coins were scarce and transactions difficult, John Law's paper money was like a timely rain, injecting urgently needed liquidity into commerce. Merchants discovered they no longer needed to carry heavy and unsafe gold and silver through the streets. A lightweight piece of paper could complete large transactions. This convenience and relative stability made merchants and wealthy citizens quickly accept it. Through successful initial operations, John Law proved a fact to all of France. His theory worked. Paper money could indeed improve economic efficiency, and as long as credit support was proper, its value could fully rival gold. The bank's success caused John Law's status to soar in the hearts of the noble group led by the Regent. He was not satisfied with this but set out to push the bank's power toward full integration. In 1718, The Regent transferred the privileges of the Royal Bank of France to John Law's General Bank, upgrading it to the Banque Royal Bank. This step marked a qualitative change in credit endorsement and a monopoly on the right to issue currency. The bank's credibility no longer relied solely on John Law's personal ability but was directly guaranteed by the King of France. This raised the credit of paper money to an unprecedented height, and he began to use the royal bank's paper money to repay part of the national debt, fulfilling his promise to solve debt with credit. At this point, John Law firmly held the economic lifeline of France and controlled the floodgates of currency. However, he clearly understood that relying solely on the bank's stability and credit could not quickly make paper money completely replace livre coins, nor could it free the French government from the quagmire of 3 billion in debt. To realize his monetary revolution, he needed a massive entity to integrate national assets, absorb all national debt, and provide an infinitely growing value anchor for paper money. He turned his gaze to the distant North American colony, the Mississippi Company. The Mississippi Company nominally held the monopoly on trade rights for France's Louisiana colony in North America. But John Law's brilliance lay in not letting the company rely on actual, slow trade profits to support the stock price. Instead, he directly bundled national credit assets and future expectations. First, he portrayed North America as a golden continent yet to be developed. John Law declared that the value of the paper money he issued would be supported by the Mississippi Company's huge expected profits from the North American colony in the future. This meant that holding Royal Bank paper money endowed purchasing power with infinite imagination of North American gold. In addition, to ensure demand and circulation for paper money, John Law stipulated that Mississippi Company shares could only be purchased with paper money issued by the Royal Bank. This rule cleverly played a dual role. First, it pushed paper money circulation. To snatch up shares, people had to first exchange their coins for the bank's paper money, effectively reducing the pressure of coin outflow and making paper money the hard currency in the market. Second, it locked in speculative capital. Speculators were trapped within the financial tools designed by John Law. To profit, they had to participate in this paper money game, thereby ensuring the funds needed for the initial operation of the paper money system. After initially stabilizing the circulation of paper money, John Law launched the most critical step: debt replacement. He issued an invitation to all investors holding old French national debt: exchange your debt notes for Mississippi Company shares at a high price. The brilliance of this operation lay in it being a complete restructuring of the financial system. For creditors, they exchanged an uncertain asset representing the government owes me money for an asset with infinite imagination representing I own future North American profits. They obtained a premium on paper and were deeply locked into this company. For the government, the massive national debt was thus transferred to the Mississippi Company. The government's fiscal pressure seemingly vanished instantly, but in reality, it came at the cost of transferring national credit risk to a private company. As debt replacement continued, the scale of the Mississippi Company expanded rapidly. It was no longer just a trading company. John Law began to merge all national assets capable of generating stable income into the Mississippi Company. He quickly annexed a series of state monopoly businesses, including tobacco monopoly rights, minting rights, and even all tax collection. The purpose of this series of operations was very clear. One was real value support. These monopoly businesses could bring stable and huge cash flows. The company used this income to pay dividends, providing tangible real-world support for that distant North American gold. 2 was to consolidate public confidence. 3 was to achieve a closed system loop. By annexing minting and tax rights, John Law effectively made the Mississippi Company the shadow central government of France. This allowed him to unify all of the country's economic activities: tax collection, currency issuance, borrowing, and trade under the financial tools he controlled, pushing his theoretical system to the most thorough stage of practice. By 1719, John Law pushed for the final fusion. All businesses of the Royal Bank were merged into the Mississippi Company. This meant that the power to issue currency, the Royal Bank's function, and the right to imagine wealth, the Mississippi Company's stock value, were completely unified in the hands of one entity. John Law controlled the power to print banknotes, and these banknotes were guided to purchase the constantly soaring stock of his own company. Everything was sprinting toward the peak of John Law's theory. The issuance volume of paper money and the value of company stock were forcibly bundled together. Every rise in stock price rationalized more paper money issuance, and more paper money issuance further pushed up the stock price. the company was no longer a trade entity. It became the economic hub of France, a massive financial machine supported by credit, debt, and infinite North American fantasy. When John Law's financial system completed the integration, packaging national credit and massive debt into the Mississippi Company, an unprecedented speculative frenzy swept across all of France. This was no longer a game for a few financiers. It was a feast for the whole people, a collective carnival of FOMO, fear of missing out. The center of stock trading, Rue Quincampoix in Paris, completely turned into a melting pot of human desire. The street was incredibly congested. People would pay any price to get a chance to buy or sell stock. Speculators conducted transactions of staggering amounts in street-side cafes and even in carriages. Stock prices didn't rise by the day, but by the hour and minute. At this point, the stock price had completely detached from the Mississippi Company's actual valuation of the distant North American colony. The only thing supporting the price was the core belief of the greater fool theory that tomorrow, there would be a greater fool to take over at a higher price. People rushed in not because they saw profit, but because they were afraid of being left behind. This was a collective fear of missing an opportunity. The characteristic of this mania was universal participation. It broke all traditional class boundaries. Nobles who had passed down their titles for generations sold ancestral lands and jewelry to raise funds to buy more stock. Ironically, many coachmen, cooks, and even maids who were originally their servants accumulated more wealth than their masters overnight by buying stock at low prices. People even built simple shacks on the street to wait for trading, then rented these shacks out at high prices as trading seats to those who wanted to enter the inner circle. This mass mania became the sole behavioral code of the entire society. People's thinking patterns were completely changed. The production and consumption patterns of the entire society were highly financialized. Small vendors selling bread and fruit began discussing stock trends. They no longer believed in the livelihoods they relied on for survival, but in the wealth miracle brought by a piece of paper. The newly rich spent lavishly, using their overnight wealth to buy the most luxurious clothes, the most expensive horses, and hold the most extravagant banquets. Paris entered the most absurdly extravagant stage in its history. Everything seemed so real, as if France had truly found an eternal source of wealth. However, this prosperity was built on credit expansion and future fantasy. France's economy was completely financialized. Massive social capital was drained from grain production and trade into financial speculation, burying the foreshadowing for the final collapse. Any financial structure built on rapid credit expansion can only stand tall when confidence persists. When the Mississippi Company's stock touched a peak of over 14,000 livres, the confidence needed to support this massive financial machine reached its irrational physical limit. The signals of collapse are often faint but fatal. The first to sense danger were those smart investors who benefited earliest, and some clear-headed nobles. They realized that the speed of paper money issuance had far exceeded any future profits the Mississippi Company could promise. They began quietly selling their stock, exchanging the earned paper money for more reliable coins, and then quickly smuggling these gold and silver funds out of the country. This quiet selling soon triggered a chain reaction. When rumors spread on the streets that John Law's system was starting to have problems, massive panic erupted. The peak of the panic was the last and most fatal policy correction John Law attempted to take. He faced the most difficult choice in theoretical practice. Let the stock price continue to rise blindly, triggering hyperinflation and ultimately causing paper money to collapse completely, or hit the brakes immediately to try and stabilize the currency value. He chose the latter. John Law attempted to forcibly fix or even lower the value of the stock through decrees and limit the speed of paper money issuance. His intention was to stabilize the overheated inflation and protect the credit of paper money. However, this act was like personally piercing the last layer of the bubble's skin. In a market of speculative mania, limiting the rise is equivalent to declaring the end of the bubble. Everyone understood that if the government and the issuer themselves thought the price was too high, then the only direction for the stock price was down. This immediately triggered the first wave of panic selling. People no longer believed tomorrow would be more expensive. Instead, they thought in terror, I must sell today. When the stock price began to freefall, people immediately understood the true risk of paper money. People no longer believed paper money could be exchanged for the fantastical North American gold, nor did they believe it could be exchanged for coins at any time. Angry crowds swarmed the Royal Bank demanding to exchange for coins, but all real metal had been replaced by Mississippi stock. Crowds lining up to exchange faced empty vaults in the bank. John Law's system. This massive machine built on national credit and infinite confidence disintegrated with a crash at this moment. In just a few weeks, the Mississippi Company's stock price plummeted from a high of over 14,000 livres to less than 1,000 livres, eventually becoming worthless. Those who had bet their entire fortunes went bankrupt overnight. John Law, the former economic czar, was forced to flee Paris in panic under the cover of night. Law never used this speculative bubble for personal gain. Even in the poverty of his exile, Law refused financial help offered by the Regent. Until his death, he still firmly believed his theory was correct and always hoped to be recalled to France to complete his unfinished monetary revolution. 2 years later, Regent Philippe II died under immense pressure. Believing in John Law and his financial strategy until the end, the collapse of the Mississippi bubble brought decades of economic trauma to France. But this historical tragedy profoundly revealed the fate of financial reform. Advanced theory itself is not a sin, but reformers underestimated the irrationality of human nature and the destructive power of the old system on credit. John Law's central bank and credit expansion theories were ahead of their time. His failure lay in using a radical financial tool to solve a deep-rooted political and credit problem, ultimately being devoured by the speculative mania he ignited himself. This craziest speculative carnival in financial history finally ended gloomily with the reformer and the regent holding on to their respective beliefs.